For those of us in the message, Jeffersonville, Indiana was a very sacred place. During Easter each year, message believers from all parts of the world made their way to the city of Jeffersonville, Indiana, just north of Louisville, Kentucky. My family was no different. Like the other families in the religious movement, we had immediate family, extended family, and close friends that lived in or near the Jeffersonville area. Friends and family, however, were not what brought us to the small southern Indiana town. Our journey was a pilgrimage of religious intent, and our focus was on heavenly things, not the things or the people of this world. Still, we were happy to be together again. I can still remember making the long trip before my family migrated from the Midwest back to Jeffersonville. I remember the spiritual thoughts that went through our minds as we looked out the window of our vehicle and watched the rolling fields pass by. We were heading to a place that felt just like home, even if home was hundreds of miles away, and very few of my memories of Jeffersonville had my immediate family or myself in them. My memories were similar to the memories of others who made the pilgrimage to Jeffersonville. Memories of the life and times of William Marion Branham, the man that we believe to be the prophet for our age. They were memories of a humble man with very humble beginnings as a curious child raised in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky with his siblings. Vivid images of memories he shared about being a young boy trapping and fishing to feed his family in the hills of Kentucky flooded my mind at just the thought of hearing his life story. At an early age, the prophet had migrated to Jeffersonville, Indiana, where he would continue his Huckleberry Finn lifestyle long into his adulthood. I thought about his early days as a young minister, how painful it must have been to suffer the trials that he faced. The loss of his first wife and daughter during the Great Flood of 1937 must have been more than he could bear. Yet he prevailed for the sole purpose of bringing us the message, which we believe to be sent by God Himself to prepare us for the soon-coming destruction of the United States. It was Easter, a time when most Christians celebrated the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Message believers from all parts of the world traveled to the prophet's hometown in Jeffersonville each Easter. There were events and gatherings almost every day during the week of Easter, from picnics at the local parks and singings in buildings or rooms rented for the occasion, to speeches, sermons, and testimonies in practically every place that people could gather. We crowded into rented spaces and into the living rooms of local message families. Sure, other Christians were celebrating the birth and resurrection of Jesus Christ, but we were celebrating much, much more. We came together in reverence for the prophet and his message. When our car crossed the bridge over the Ohio River into Jeffersonville, we could almost feel the presence of someone greater. It was very exciting, even for us children, and not just because of the events scheduled to entertain the children and the young adults. I looked eagerly through the window of our car, watching the memories come to life and thinking about the places that the prophet described in his recorded sermons. As the buildings whizzed by, the windows of our vehicle became moving pictures of those memories. From the mighty Ohio River to the turn-of-the-century buildings and the people out walking on the city sidewalks. This was our prophet's city. Jeffersonville was the city chosen by God for the prophet to build his tabernacle. We were told that angels lined the walls of that building. It was a sacred, hallowed place. The building itself was nothing fancy to look upon. It was just a simple red brick building that sat on the corner of a small neighborhood city block downtown. It had 2 glass entry doors that opened into a tiny foyer where one of the church's deacons usually stood to smile and shake hands as the faithful entered. Above the door to the building hung an eagle, wings spread, holding an actual sword in its talons. The sword had been replaced several times, and it had drawn significant interest in the local community, especially that of the ne'er-do-wells who would steal the weapon from time to time for their own dastardly purpose. Across the street from the church to the south and to the west sat rows of small houses, almost close enough to one another for occupants to shake hands with each other through adjacent windows. Sometimes people sitting on their front porches would smile and wave at us as we made our way down the sidewalk towards the tabernacle. We smiled and waved back, and I often wondered if they knew the prophet, or the reason why we gathered. People who lived closest to the tabernacle were not so friendly, however, and they did not seem to view our gathering favorably. I'm sure it must have made their lives difficult before and after services as the crowd flowed out of the building and into the streets in front of their homes. When my journey began, the little red brick building was just as I remembered it as a child. The small, one-story building could barely hold all the people that flooded into it each Easter. So many men, women, and children arrived each year that the church purchased the properties to the north and 2 properties to the west for additional parking. In the lot adjacent to the tabernacle, a large tent was sometimes set up for the overflow. Visitors sat and listened to the sermon over loudspeakers that were connected to a shortwave radio installed at the church during the time that the prophet was alive. Many families, including my own, sometimes chose to sit in the comfortable seats of our vehicles with the air conditioner running while we listened to the service over the radio. The weather in the Ohio River Valley was unpredictable, and you could never know if it might be raining or hot and humid or shivering cold. Regardless of where we chose to listen, the level of excitement was always the same. All of us, men, women, and children, were eager to hear more about the prophet. Sometimes they were stories about the prophet and the speaker's experiences during the prophet's life. Often brief stories were used, sometimes comical ones, warming up the audience for the burst of excitement about to come. As the service continued, the pace of words gradually increased until an explosion of rapid sentences left the speaker screaming and gasping for breath. At the beginning, microphones and loudspeakers were required to hear the speaker's very careful and articulate statements. By the end, however, the volume overpowered the system so badly that if not for his voice echoing through the building, not a single word could have been understood. It was unfortunate for those of us in our vehicles or in the tent outside, for there were times when we had no idea what was being said. Many message speakers in many different countries and regions within those countries had different styles of speaking, but their theme was always the same. The time of the prophet's apocalyptic predictions was upon us, and the rapture should have already taken place. The sermons often reminded us that we were living on borrowed time. They reminded us that the world was soon coming to a tragic and horrific end, and that we must continue living the prophet's specific version of the Pentecostal holiness lifestyle in order to escape damnation. The prophet's name was mentioned frequently and emphatically. As children, some of us didn't really think too much about the world ending, but when we grew up into adults, we were often reminded. We believed that William Branham was sent to warn us of the events leading to the end of days, and each speaker felt it was their sworn duty to maintain the same level of urgency in their sermons as the prophet did decades before. After the service, it was though the floodgates for the Ohio River were opened at the front, sides, and back of the Branham Tabernacle. From the inside coming out, it seemed to take 10 minutes to make a single step as lines flowed from each of the pews into the center aisles or to each side of the building to a tiny exit. Watching from the outside, it was like watching fireworks explode from the inside. People quickly poured out into the streets to the west and south and into the parking lot adjacent to the building. Deacons attempted to corral the people out of the streets in accordance with city ordinances, but with the heavy volume of people flooding out into the streets, The tiny ropes they used did very little to stop the multitude. We stood together, sometimes for hours, talking to fellow message believers from all parts of the world. Looking back, these were special times. Many fond memories were made and many bonds of friendship were created that seemed strong enough never to be broken. We had special ties that bound us together, ties that the world did not have. We had the message. We knew the prophet almost personally. We knew his words intimately. During those times, I could have never dreamed about the journey that would lie ahead. The thought of leaving the message or its people was so foreign to me that I would have gladly faced death before even considering it. I had no reason to leave. The message was presented as absolute, verified truth that had been vindicated through time. No question had been asked that could not be answered, and no answer had been given that could not have been unequivocally proven by the prophet's own words. Or so I thought, because I had been told. It is more accurate and up to date than today's newspaper, my grandfather often said. If you have any doubt, just play a tape and see whether or not it works out exactly as it should be. Little did I know that the road ahead would look much different than the road left behind, or that the unbreakable bonds of friendship would become so fragile and quickly severed with a single question. The journey in front of me would be surprising, painful, eventful, and sometimes unbelievable. When I first began to research the prophet and his message, there were many stones overturned that had not been moved for decades. What I found underneath those stones had been carefully concealed by many men and women who stood much to gain. As much as it would pain me to slowly realize, some of those involved in controlling that information were very close to me.